brand name of. If Zuckerberg was just an employee, happens to be the shareholder, so a double fiction. No soliciting means that you're not misusing the information to lure away the key assets. And ladies and gentlemen, you are the future key assets. So you are the target of that clause to move from one company to the other. The funny thing is that the assets are human beings with fundamental rights guaranteed by constitutions with a free will. And if you work for Shell and then move to British Petroleum, it's your choice, you know. So there you see a sort of issue. So what if a employee moves from one company to the other? Is that an infringement of the confidentiality and no soliciting clause? Or is that just, you know, those things happen, leading to all kinds of potential litigation? And then there is this time period thing that you say, well, is that information confidential for eternity? Or should we say that the moment that Shell is actually getting the Chinese oil fields and everybody knows, and then it's not confidential anymore because it's public? And so you try to manage the scope in time in such a agreement. In practical terms, if in your future job your task is purchase a company, then the first 2 weeks are ruined by the confidentiality agreement before all the dots are on the right places and you figure out who should sign the agreement, etc. So here you see a sort of easy story of purchasing a company, and then the hard work reality and your first confrontation with the legal department who said you need a correct signature of the confidentiality agreement, etc. So that's one. Then we move to the letter of intent, because you need time to purchase a whole company, because it's more complicated than a chair or a cup of cappuccino. And to manage the obligations of the parties in that period that you are negotiating, you regulate it by a private contract law, Michael Milo, with clauses like, herewith we enter into a negotiation between this date and Christmas. And during the information, or during the negotiation, we inform each other about essential information. And, next slide is on the due diligence. The buyer is allowed to investigate the details of the company. And roughly speaking, we think that the purchase price might be somewhere in the range of 3 billion. And we acknowledge, now that it is a public company, that in the actual process of the share purchase agreement, we go together through all the steps, like a public bid, asking the anti-competition authority for approval, and all those other steps. So you agree on the whole process. What's the issue here? Because with each contract, the key question and the fear of business people is that sort of binding? Is the letter of intent, with different names like letter of intent, memorandum of understanding, memorandum of negotiation, all kinds of titles, is that already a purchase agreement in disguise? Because if you say, I want your company, will be roughly 2 billion, and by Eastern I want to be owner, and then you could say that is already a complete agreement. So one of the themes in the letter of intent world is it not too precise that it is already the purchase? And is it not too vague that it's nothing? So that is sort of fine-tuning affair on the process. Other title is Heads of Agreement or Agreement in Principle, but I dare to say that the most common name on the globe is Letter of Intent, LOI. And then a typical exam question is such a letter of intent binding? And then tentatively you answer with no, because you think of the purchase. No, it's not the purchase agreement. So it's not a binding purchase agreement. But the correct answer to the question is, yes, it's legally binding pertaining to the steps in the process. Because the contract is binding. So if it says, I have access to the company information until Christmas, that's a binding agreement. So here you see sort of the dynamic of words. And I warned you that beware of letters of intent that are already binding purchase agreements. So as an entrepreneur you remember, oh, I don't need to purchase already the company without the information. Feels like not binding. But from a legal perspective, whatever contract you sign, it's binding, and binding pertaining to what is in the contract. So I hope that until so far you feel that these are all statements of open door character, like I hope that you have that feeling. But sort of fine-tuning the language. And then one of the last items to mention is whether the negotiation is on an exclusive basis or not. Exclusive basis is that when British Petroleum and Shell are in a merger discussion, that they promise each other, I only talk to you. Or that they are also talking to ExxonMobil, Saudi companies, you know, whatever. And that is something you might know from trading stuff on Marktplaats or something like that, you know, where the seller just wants to sell, you know, second-hand study books. Who cares? Who buys? So the seller is not interested in exclusivity. But you have to realize that the buyer needs to invest in the whole process, hiring you, KPMG, Ernst & Young, law firms to do all those investigations. That can cost, you know, 10 million. And you don't want to, as a buyer, spend all that money and then hear halfway that they say, oh, we sold it already, sorry. Ding dong, I'm here to purchase your second-hand couch. Oh, sorry, I sold it. And it's sort of not a appreciative inter-party behavior. But if it is in the letter of intent, you know, it's a sort of in-your-face clause. It says, this negotiation is on an exclusive basis. It's a binding clause, which means you're not allowed to drink coffee with the others. But what happens if on a conference or in the plane you meet, you know, the Saudi oil company? Hey, can I buy you, you know? Oh, he's in a negotiation with another. So in this field, and ladies and gentlemen, on a daily basis, 20 major companies are changing hands. So as we speak, these types of transactions are taking place on the globe. And all those participants are, what's the phrase, walking on eggs? Because they're bound by all kinds of letters of intent. And they are not allowed to say things about this, but with other parties they're obliged to say things. Stressful. That's your world, hopefully, somehow. Or as a state regulator who tries to avoid manipulation of the market. Because what happens if two parties are interested, that's good for the seller, because the price goes up. offer an acceptance market mechanism. So the economic idea is, let's not do exclusivity, because that ruins the price. So here you have the world of the letter of intent, which could take another 2 weeks to negotiate on the terms of the letter of intent, which is already 4 weeks. You know, in those 4 weeks there are, what is it, 40 working days times 20, a large amount of companies are already sold in the meantime. And then the due diligence. The due diligence is sort of umbrella term for the activities of the investigation of the target company. That is the check by the potential buyer whether the object that is to be bought, a company, is sort of in good standing and in good shape. As in, is it true what they say on the website that they have 200 daughter companies? Because those big companies, they are buying and selling daughter companies, legal persons, on a monthly basis. So we already heard that it takes sort of 4 weeks or 8 weeks until you have the paperwork in place to start the investigation. Let's talk about InBev, Belgium, or let's talk about Heineken. They have all over the world plans and trademarks of beer. I don't know the number, something like 290 different types of beer they own. But in 2 months they own maybe 294 or 250, you know, because they made a deal in the meantime while discussing let's purchase Heineken. So imagine that the idea of the buyer is, okay, the beer in Australia is owned by Heineken, I love that beer, I want to purchase that. You want to know for sure that by the time you put your signature and you get the shares, so the legal transaction, they did not sell the Australian brand. Because they do that on a sort of monthly basis. Because people like you work there and they say, okay, we have an offer for the Australian brand. Excel, there's a profit for us. Choop, 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 choop. Let's sell it. As a separate, not public transaction, but a private transaction of that one subsidiary. Due diligence, who are conducting that? Those are the advisors of the seller. And they look into the financial situation, the legal situation, the personnel situation, the brand name situation, the registration of the patents, you know, all kinds of essential status quo information. Corporate structure, the taxation, obviously the liabilities in the sense of pending litigation. Think of the purchase by buyer of the company Monsanto. And Monsanto was involved in an American litigation on that product called Roundup, sort of poison, and they were quite successful the last 50 years to sell that poison because, you know, that was good for, no one knows what the purpose was, but and that was a sort of litigation that was already pending for 10 years. And the guys of Bayer, a German company, thought, okay, we are a European company, we can settle that litigation because we are good in, you know, crisis management. And they lost. And then the value of Monsanto was sort of 30% less, and consequently the share price of Bayer, the mother company, was, I believe, 11% reduced. So it's one thing to investigate a company, and it's another thing to make a decision on the basis of that information. because the entrepreneurs are not lawyers, you know. If entrepreneurs would just act on no risk situation, then there was no economy. So the beauty is that the due diligence produces a report, and I discuss this because in 15 months this is the type of work you will do, because it's a nice warm-up task in whatever role you have, to do due diligence report in a team with lawyers, economists, you know, philosophers, tax advisors, and you learn how companies are designed, and you learn that all the companies are sort of a mess, you know, documents missing, and because here we portray the world as a sort of orderly thingy, and the reality is that even stock market listed companies are missing documents, you know. Where's the contract of board member number 11? It's gone, never made, you know. And then you might expect that if you make a long list of problems of the target company, an entrepreneur would say, I dislike it. No, they say, I don't care, but in my negotiation, I will reduce the purchase price with 2%.
I don't have an answer for that. Is there something else I can help with?
Yes, I need to take a question from in the back of the audience. Thank you. There you go.
I was wondering, where does the due diligence of the buyer meet dealing in bad faith of the seller? To what extent is it the due diligence of the buyer and bad faith of the seller? Or are we going to
Yeah. So the question is, what about the bad faith of the seller? Or rephrased, what if the seller hides information? Think of purchasing an old house in the Utrecht inner city. Then you can send in a due diligence person called a construction engineer to check sort of the physical state of that old 17th century house. And if afterwards you can prove that the seller hid sort of water damage spots in the house, and you can prove that he knew it, then it's a breach of the sales contract, the share purchase agreement, where there's a clause that says the seller declares that he's not aware of any other negative sides of the object he is selling. So the things you discovered yourself are then in the ultimate contract made clear, and then there's no guarantee on that there is a roof that needs to be fixed. So as a buyer, you know the roof is not okay. But if then it turns out that after the sale that it is completely rotten, and then it's a battle between the due diligence personnel who might have figured it out, or the obligation of the seller to disclose that he knew that it was rotten because he had a report in his cupboard of that nature. So in the purchase agreement you try to strike that balance. And the consequence of default, of cheating, is that the sale purchase agreement can be dissolved, annulled, on paper, in theory, and that the ownership returns to the seller and you get your purchase price back. Now we put this to a dispersed shareholdership situation with shareholders in the Royal Palace and on the Maldives and in Brazil, you know. Then there's no way that you can reverse the transaction and knock on the door of the former shareholder on the Bahamas and want my money back. That's a no-go. So, in 15 months, your boss will put this sort of intensity on your desk, make sure that you find the rotten construction part. And remember, a company, the legal persons, shareholdership of all the daughter companies, the assets, and you have to check all the plans and all the machines are there on the name of that legal person or of someone else. So you need to check everything. Is the Workers' Council happy? Did they play along the rules? And then remember, in a multinational enterprise, a due diligence will be executed in all the 150 jurisdictions where Coca-Cola, Microsoft, Shell is active. And that is why there are worldwide firms like KPMG, Ernst & Young, PricewaterhouseCoopers, because part of their money they earn that teams in all those 150 countries are at the same time investigating all the daughter companies to make one report on Coca-Cola or whatever. Well, and those big companies are so expensive that no one wants to buy them, but you know, it happens once in a while. And that is why it is fun to be in this industry, because then all of a sudden you're in the middle of the night on a phone call with your colleague in the Philippines, who happens to be having the same degree from Manila University and having had the same training in PricewaterhouseCoopers, and has sort of a new friend, and then share information like, wow, I have this daughter company, Coca-Cola Netherlands, and you have Coca-Cola Philippines, and what about the personnel, and quite interesting. And then in the end you try to strike that balance in the best economical way. Consequences, price negotiations, and the words connected to the answer to that question are warranties and indemnifications. Warranty is a promise. I promise that the roof is not leaking. I promise that I own all the machinery in the daughter companies. Warranties. And that's a negotiation, because the buyer wants warranties on everything. That the sanitator of the headquarters is cleaning the floor in a safe way, you know? And then the buyer says, what do you think yourself? And so you don't want these sale purchase agreements to exceed 10,000 pages. And because then no one is able to read it. With warranties. I warrant that the lamps are okay and not exploding in the next 2 weeks, you know? Who knows? So warranties and indemnifications is that the seller indemnifies, so pays the costs in case the buyer has further costs. Think of the Monsanto litigation. They are they got a verdict to pay, I don't know, $2 billion. And then an indemnification in the share purchase agreement could have been that the seller is paying that $2 billion. And how could you guarantee that they have the money? And the solution is to put a part of the purchase price in an escrow account in a third-party civil notary firm somewhere on the globe, and that part of the purchase price is only released after the litigation is finished. And if they did not lose, then the $2 billion in the escrow account, so a reserved piece of money, is then released to the seller. So they have to wait on their money. So the link between warranties, indemnifications, and the purchase price is that you can delay parts of the purchase price until you know for sure that all the rotten roofs are fixed or not there. And then one of the themes of the due diligence is CSR, corporate social responsibility, about what is your effort to combat child labor, environmental pollution, and all kinds of stuff like that? Which is a emerging theme within due diligence and rather complicated. Because what is sort of the level of responsibility? And so this is a evolving theme, the due diligence and the content of the due diligence, and you will most likely, one way or the other, part of that world. And then the final agreement, just to repeat, is just a piece of paper, 3,000 pages, sort of the closing Bibles. Lawyers who create that have a habit to bind that in sort of book binding thing, so that they can put that in their cupboards to show off that they made many deals. And legal professionals and accountants or advisory firm employees are sort of listed in sort of ranking, sort of sports ranking, in terms of the number of transactions they do on a yearly basis, / the value of that transaction. So the transaction around Vattenfall Nuon that took 1.5 years, value 5 billion, and that was sort of achievement by that person, and reason for bonuses, etc. And then sort of 20 transactions per year in those teams is a sort of number you meet. And so when you are doing this work, you're sort of doing that with 10 companies at the same time. And then you have to pick up the phone with the correct name, you know, and put the right name on the report and stuff like that. And that is why we nag on precision in your paperwork. That you write a paper with the correct name on it, etc. Because that matters if you have to produce 20 reports. And that is to be discussed in the workshop lecture. Let's move to a well-deserved break of 11 minutes and then continue with the asset deal and the legal merger. See you in a bit.